Hi, my name is Patricia Miller, and this is my screencast for ATM 101, Unit 15. This week we are comparing the weather between Anchorage and Kodiak and their comparison to the climatic averages for the end of January, beginning of February, and March of 2014. First, we're going to take a look at the Anchorage weather, and this is the temperature graph for the end of January, beginning of February on the left, and then the March temperature graph is on the right. The red lines are the NWS data for the actual recorded data for each day, and the black lines are the climatic data temperature averages for those days. In the first graph on the left, you see that the temperatures recorded for January 26th through the 31st are a bit above the averages. Into the beginning of February, you can see that the temperature returns to the average range of temperatures that are normal for this time of year. In the graph on the right, which is the temperatures for March in Anchorage, you can see that the NWS actual recorded temperatures and the climate data averages are in sync with each other. For the first part of the week, the temperatures are a tad bit higher than the averages, but then they sort of go back into containment between the average temperature lines at the end of the week. So you can see that this March is a pretty typical March in comparison to previous Marches that Anchorage has had. I would have to say that March is the best representation of the Anchorage climate because it is the most consistent with the averages. Here are the dew point and relative humidity graphs for the Anchorage area for both January to February and the March graph. Here in January-February graph on the left, you can see that January 26th and through January 29th, the dew point and the relative humidity are sort of chaotic, and it has a really dramatic low of the relative humidity on Monday, January 27th. And this little time frame here is matched up with the unusually warm weather that we had at the beginning of the week on the previous slide. So it kind of makes sense that it's a little bit off kilter here. So on the right, you can see that the March's graph holds a very distinct pattern, and all the dew points are relatively low, and all the relative humidities have the same up and down cycle that they have. And as you saw on the previous slide, the temperatures were staying pretty much in sync with the climatic averages. So for a typical March, for this graph to have steady pattern, it makes sense. Here's a look at the temperature graph for Kodiak in March. What's interesting here is that in the front of the graph we did not have the dramatic cooling, low temperatures at night like we see throughout the week. And I think this is due to the cloud coverage that has dissipated throughout the week. Another interesting thing to note here is that you see every point is above the average temperature line. So all the high temperatures was above the average. So that's pretty interesting. This is the graph for dew point and relative humidity for Kodiak in March. You can see on this graph that they're in comparison with the Anchorage relative humidity and dew point graph, this is not have a consistent pattern. Also, the relative humidity lines and the dew point lines touch and overlap or are very close a lot of the times, as you can see throughout the week. I think this is due to the fact that Kodiak has a more humid and wet climate. Overall, the dew point is much higher than the Anchorage area. The relative humidity in Anchorage has a very consistent pattern of up and down for relative humidity. But here you see it's very jagged, not have a consistent pattern. Another thing to note is that the Anchorage relative humidity has a much steady, longer range, again going back to the consistent up and down, Um, and here in Kodiak, we don't have as much of a steady range, but in Anchorage, we have a very small range of dew point temperatures, but here we have a much larger range. So that's sort of an interesting thing to look at. Next, we're going to take a look at some of the weather maps and satellite images from the days that we just talked about on the graphs. Anchorage is located here at this top star, and Kodiak is located on the bottom star. As you can see, Kodiak is right on the edge of a low, so that makes sense for the temperature graphs of us not having the drastic cold night for, the clear nights are colder than normal, so that's why at the beginning of the graph we didn't have that drastic low temperatures for the evenings. Another thing that was interesting to see was that at the beginning of the graph for the Anchorage temperatures was much higher than the average, and so you can see that here where the high is affecting Anchorage area, and it also affects the chaotic dew point relative humidity patterns as seen on the previous slide. Here's February 1st, 2014. The weather map and the satellite images show that there is scattered cloud coverage everywhere. The low seen here is moving sort of northward, and there are highs all around. If we look at the visible map, it's pretty consistent with what we're seeing on the TV weather map, with clouds all over the place. If we took a look at the water vapor map, you can see that there are many spots with concentrated water vapor, like right down here at the base of where the low is indicated on the TV weather map. But the Anchorage and Kodiak areas are pretty light in comparison to other more concentrated areas, which is interesting because the dew point in Anchorage on the graphs spiked on that day at about 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and then the relative humidity was at 95%. So it's consistent with what's happening that day. It's just really interesting to see it on a map. Here is a look at March 23rd, the weather map and the satellite images. There seems to be a lot of scattered clouds again, and we can see from the visible and the water vapor images that there's a lot of cloud coverage all around, but there is a little sliver right here in the middle between Anchorage and Kodiak where there's no water vapor and there's not many clouds. And so it's just interesting to see where all other areas was pretty much covered in water vapor and clouds, and the Kodiak area and the Anchorage area just between them was clear. Taking a look at March 27th, this was the most interesting day to me because, again, there is no indication of heavy cloud coverage at all on the TV weather map and on the visible map, but you can see on the water vapor map that there's water vapor all over in Kodiak and Anchorage areas. So again, on the dew point, well, this is for Kodiak, the dew point and relative humidity graph, the two lines were touching that day for about 6 hours. So it's interesting to see how the water vapor map and the TV weather map can be so different, but it provides a really good indication of what the humidity is doing for that day. So my theory as to why Kodiak was much warmer this March is that in the northern areas of Alaska and Canada, as we had seen on the TV weather maps, high pressures were predominant in those areas, and for this week, the winds, I know on my observations for that week, were coming down from the northeasterly areas, and so I think that the air masses that were over those areas in the northern Alaska and Canada areas with the high pressures, those air masses took on those properties from being in high pressures and were pushed down towards Kodiak with the northeasterly winds, and so that's why we got such warm weather. So that's a look at the comparison between Anchorage and Kodiak as individual climates and how they relate to each other, and their daily observations in comparison to the climatic averages. So thanks for watching.